This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development, providing graduate-level education to working professionals, online, on campus, and on-site. For more information, please visit study.stanford.edu.
Our speaker today is also from SAP, which he characterized a moment ago as having people's perception as being a stodgy German company, and I can assure you it's not. They have an interesting organization here in Palo Alto, and he's going to be speaking on quite the reverse of enterprise management, open source research, analytics, economics, and best practices. He is deeply involved in some of the more interesting of today's open source systems, and is one of the organizers for a Wiki Symposium, Wiki Sim, which is being held in Montreal. He'll tell you a little more about that. Dirk?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Dennis, for the introduction and the invitation in the first place. As you just said, this is about open source research, software engineering research, a bit of applied economics, but mostly software engineering research. But before I go there, I got the permission or mutual requirement to plug a research conference that's fairly recent about wikis. We just reached an important point. If you have an information or entertainment need, say around dogs, and you were looking for a dog blog in the past, today we just reached that point about more than searching for a dog blog, you would be searching for a dog wiki if Google Trends is any indicator. And when I looked up this chart about search volume on Google, about wikis versus blogs, I noticed something that should have been quite apparent much earlier on, which is that Wikipedia is satisfying even more information needs around something. So people search for Wikipedia a lot more often than for wikis or blogs. And that is surprising if you look at the news reference volume, because blogs are so important in the news as opposed to wikis that are just much lower. Now, if you were doing wiki research, for quite a while you didn't have an outlet until we started the Wiki Symposium in 2005. It's an academic research conference, peer-reviewed, archival. The proceedings are in the ACM Digital Library. And the 2007 instance will take place in Montreal this year in a week or 2 weeks from now, co-located with ACM Uppsala. So I would like to encourage anyone who's interested in wikis, Wikipedia, technology, social aspects, process, quality of wikis, all the good things around it, to come to the Wiki Symposium. And this is an annual conference. But now let me move on to my main talk, open source research. At SAP, SAP has always been using and contributing and leading open source projects, but this was application or using it and doing research about it has been done only for about a year, basically with me joining the company and joining other folks who had done some initial work. We're 3 researchers, full-time researchers, work with interns, and we are hiring full-time employees, full-time researchers, as well as interns, of course. I structured the talk into 5 main areas. I will shortly speak about the significance, maybe in a more interesting way than you'd usually think, and then make an argument why open source is actually sustainable beyond all the hoopla of commercial open source software startups or what you read in the press, why there are economic models behind it that make it sustainable in the long run. And after that, I'll be going from the economics to more traditional software engineering research. Open source research is quite interesting because for the first time, we have hard data by tracking in places like SourceForge and the code repositories what people are doing in software development processes. Previously in software engineering research, there was software that was being developed behind closed doors. Now, for the first time, we have a large database that we can analyze for how people actually act with feet on the ground. We call that open source analytics. So I'll be presenting some results there, and then move on to best practices of open source in corporations and what's interesting about it from a research perspective. So who's contributed to an open source project around here? So very good, thanks. So you know that the definition is open source software that's provided in source code form, typically for free, and that you can modify for your own needs and also redistribute. That's typically regulated by the license. It's important then to notice that in working open source projects, you have a community around it, and that moves the project forward. And what's particularly interesting in comparison to traditional software engineering, software development processes, is that these projects are self-organizing and work based on egalitarian and meritocratic values, which is quite a departure from the traditional top-down corporate software processes. You typically turn to how much money is being made to prove that something is important. We can see how open source, here some figure, is already in the billions of dollars. It's still a small fraction of the total market, but it's clearly not neglectable. The real question, though, of course, is, okay, that's the revenue, but how does open source influence the software architectures? Because, say, here in the Valley, a common model we see is a startup that takes a LAMP stack and then puts some software on top of it. So 90% of the software they deploy may be open source software, and then 10% is the stuff they add. So we looked at some data, which I already pointed to, the analytics part, and I'll be giving you the facts and figures behind that a few slides from now, so don't ask detailed questions about this right now. But we looked to measure the significance of open source. We looked at the activities in open source projects across 5,000 open source projects. Activity here means the source lines of code added in a given week here. And so it's the change, it's the first derivative. And we can see that we get a good fit for an exponential curve of lines of code added each week to the top 5,000 open source projects out there. If you realize that, on the other hand, the number of software developers in the world is it's unclear whether it's growing or shrinking, but it certainly isn't growing exponential. So this, we're trying to prove the point in relationship to closed software and total software developer population. But it's clear that open source software is eating into traditional closed source. But let me make the argument first for why open source is here to stay. And it will be a bit different, I believe, what say, a venture capitalist or a startup would say. First, to get this out of the way, like two basic instruments, copyright and license. You can hold hours of talks about that, and I'm not a lawyer. But it's important to understand that the copyright is your right to source code, and the license regulates what others and what you can do with source code you receive, as well as open source, as well as what happens with your contributions as you make them to an open source project. So the license regulates how your source code will be handled from then on, even though you may still own the rights to a specific piece of code in there, or the overall code base. And that will become important because we need to make a distinction between something I call, or that's being called, community open source now, and commercial open source. So on this slide, we see a timeline of open source, specifically the actors or stakeholders in the open source ecosystem. And the first one to look at is the traditional, is the original open source, which we call community open source here because it really was a community of volunteers. Linux or Free Software Foundation, Emacs, etc., that developed this software, even if it was around specific people. Community open source takes the contributions of a broad community, and because of that, everyone who contributes maintains the copyright to their contribution, all of which is governed by the license. And so the rights to the software are spread around a diverse set of people, actors, legal entities. And that is a key difference to what has emerged as commercial open source software firms. Then I put the beginning here at MySQL's inception. It's not clear whether they invented that. The term commercial open source actually, I believe, comes from Sugar CRM, so that's much later. But commercial open source software firms are firms that maintain the right to the software. They may be giving users the software as open source, but they do not accept contributions, so they maintain the copyright. The copyright is owned by a company, not by a diverse community of contributors, but it's one single legal entity, the company. And that's a critical distinction because one stakeholder, one company can be bought, while a large diverse community typically cannot. So that will be an important distinction. And then, however, we'll come to, I think, are the real movers and shakers, which are the large system integrators, service companies. And we'll also look at software developer careers, how they are changing in this new ecosystem. So community open source is straightforward. As I said, it's the original open source. It's the rights to some software, say the Apache HTTP daemon, are spread around the community. Everyone can use it. You can build a business around it in terms of services, implementation services, consulting, hotline, what have you. But the key issue here is everyone else can too. It's a common good. The software is available for anyone to pick them up, can look at it, they can build the competence, they can provide services. That makes the barriers to entry to the market of providing services around the HTTP daemon very low, meaning prices for customers will be pretty good, or certainly not. Yeah. Commercial open source is this key distinction I made 2 slides earlier. Some company owns the rights to the software and typically does not accept outside code contributions. So if the company accepts, then asks the contributor to hand over copyright so that the commercial open source software firm maintains all the rights. Out of MySQL being the good example, out of this comes a dual license strategy. Companies like this make money by selling under a non-GPL license, by selling under a commercial license to companies, the services these companies may want. And what commercial open source does is it puts the company at the center of the project, and everyone who wants to do something with that project goes to that website that is run by a commercial entity. And it's not a diffuse community that tries to be fair and equal to anyone who ever contributed, more or less, but it's a commercial interest behind it, which is good. I mean, companies want other companies to provide reliable services, so that's just fine. The point, though, is the original volunteer idea is not the big thing about commercial open source, but it's that marketing and sales costs get reduced drastically. And then you provide services around it. So let me come to what I think is the most important development over the last few years, the market entry of system integrators like IBM, Accenture, Tata, etc. If you look at how someone like IBM sells services, makes deals with, say, large banks, I'm simplifying here. They sell what's called the IT value stack, or more generically, a solution to an IT problem a customer has. And such a stack, like in a simple case, consists of hardware, software, services. So let's assume IBM is selling a bank, some Dell servers with Microsoft software, and then IBM services is providing the configuration, implementation services that adapt this particular solution to the customer's need. We see that there is a demand curve, which means that the price quoted to a customer, the lower it gets, the lower the price gets, the more customers are willing to buy. And at a very high price, only a few customers are willing to buy. That's a traditional simple demand curve. And what it means is simply that bank X expects a high return on investment on deploying this solution, so they're willing to pay that much money. And some other customers don't expect that much return on investment, so they're only willing to pay much less money than that. So what's happening with open source now? If you're IBM, you're paying, and your customer wants you to deploy Microsoft software, then you'll be paying or passing on to Microsoft all those license fees and don't make a buck of it at all. Enter open source. If the IBM salesman could only convince the customer to replace the expensive, in quotation mark, Microsoft software, say, with Linux, which comes much cheaper, what basically happens is that the money that IBM has to forward to some third-party software vendor gets much lower. Maybe this is just a service company around a community open source project that offers its services in a competitive market with, remember, community open source, no barriers or little barriers to entry. Under such circumstances, basically, the IBM salesman can increase the margin, or in a first step, the pricing flexibility. Maybe the total deal size gets lower, but basically, first of all, there's pricing flexibility because one component that's not owned by IBM now costs much less. So now the IBM salesperson can turn around and sell more services to reach a price that still works for the return on investment calculation for the bank. But basically, what open source lets a service company like IBM do is increase pricing flexibility, get a higher margin out of each sale. A precondition, of course, is that the software that's the alternative to the closed source software, again, is community open source software, which comes with a cheap price point and where there can be no or little log-in to a specific provider. This is only one argument. There's a second argument to be made, which is as the pricing flexibility grows because expensive closed source is being replaced with much cheaper open source, the increased pricing flexibility lets the service company move down the demand curve. So what happens is the pricing flexibility, if IBM or whoever is willing to cut on its profits until it reaches the lower bound of zero profits, this lets them go down the demand curve and sell to more customers. Each new customer doesn't give you the full profits as the profit margin is going down, but it gives you some profit. It's actually the triangle here. That's the additional gain profit that this increased pricing flexibility through open source lets you do. So I think with the inception of the Eclipse project, more or less IBM recognized the power of using community open source to displace closed source software that is eating into its profit margin. So in those cases where it doesn't have its own offering, so it lost in the operating system space, no OS2, so the next best thing was Linux. And so IBM realized that. And so I believe what we are facing now is a second wave of community open source projects. There's the original volunteer community open source. And now companies like IBM realize the economic benefits of community open source, not commercial open source, where you get lock-in effects, but community open source, which is why they are funding it. That's why, in my opinion, more or less planned, they founded the Eclipse, created the Eclipse Foundation to bring a more traditional corporate software development process to open source. I mean, it's still an open source process, but it's soothing the minds of IBM customers to see that software is being developed under a defined governance structure in the Eclipse Software Foundation, that it has a defined software development process, etc. And it's critical because IBM products, it's one of the business strategies that you can have to add proprietary solutions on top of open source. IBM's products depend on the Eclipse Foundation. The Rational Tool Suite depends on the Eclipse Foundation platform. And so IBM needs to make sure that the platform is delivered and developed in a consistent way that matches IBM's roadmap for its proprietary offerings based on this platform. It's kind of the release train you saw recently with the Eclipse Foundation. So I'm making this point to show that there are established, very powerful players who have a clear economic incentive to move open source forward, and that they're doing so. They are putting the money where their mouth is, which is why I believe this is a sustainable movement. Now let me move on to the last stakeholder I want to discuss, which is the software developer, because the careers of software developers are changing based on what's going on in open source. If you're a open source software developer, you have a career ladder now. Small one, but you typically start out being a user. The software is available for free for download. If you provide a bug fix, you become a developer. If someone accepts your bug fix into the source code repository, that's an implicit promotion. Someone reviews your code contribution and then puts it into the repository. And if you've done this often enough and the people running the project just get tired waving your stuff through because they know it's good, they will eventually ask you or announce that you are now what I call here committer. Sometimes these terms get changed around, but a committer is someone who has direct write access to the source code repository. This is typically such a promotion is explicit and accompanied with a lot of hoopla. It's a mail to the mailing list. XYZ has done so much contribution, so good contributions. We've given him or her access rights to the open source repository, to the source code repository now. Why is that relevant? This is a status game, and we see that making the step from developer to committer is an important one. It's already good to be a developer. When I interview people and they tell me they've contributed to open source projects, first thing is I look at the code quality, what others have done, etc., because it's public. But being a committer is even more important. It's got significant economic value associated with that status. So obviously, if you're a committer, you know the software well, you're technically good, and most likely you're also socially smart, because that's equally important to effectively functioning in a software project. However, being a committer is valued to an employer, like a software firm providing services around a community open source software project, like the Apache HTTP daemon. You lend credibility to the employer that they can actually solve the technical problems. Moreover, you have, as a committer, have visibility to the community. You write emails, you help people, it's your name on the website, it's you who's giving a talk at ApacheCon or what have you, and it's you who can convert freeloading users into paying customers because you lend that credibility to your employer that they can provide the services they claim they do. And finally, if you're a committer, community open source projects, as I said, are owned and run by the people who do the work. These are the committers, or who have this powerful position in the middle of the project. So it's those guys who determine, say, what polls are put on the website about what feature to implement next. While there is no open control of open source projects, this is a way of steering open source projects. So if you're a committer, you have a say in where the project is going. And if you work for an employer that wants to align early on their strategy, the company strategy, with an open source project, if you're a committer, you can help steer the open source project in the right direction on the one hand, and on the other hand, have early information on where the project is going so that your employer is well positioned. This makes for powerful economic incentives to hire committers in open source projects. I hear this in anecdotal terms a lot. There was a study by Ilhorn Han. It's not been published, but you can access it on the web, of Apache Software Foundation committers. Study co-author was Roy Fielding, who is a founder of the Apache Software Foundation. And after controlling for all the variables that you would want to control for, like technical capabilities, etc., they found that, lo and behold, that committers earn a higher salary than regular developers. So for SAP, understanding these economics is of course important, as we have a large and diverse product portfolio. So we want to engage properly with open source in a way that makes business sense, and of course in a way that works. So let me move on to analytics. This is more from the applied economics now, software engineering process research. We really would like, as we are engaging with open source, we really need to understand how it works, because it's very different from the corporate processes that most of us, people in corporations, know. We would like to understand the practices to do them right. We would want to know who to hire and how to hire, basically how to do open source and lead our own projects. To do that, we got the database of an open source startup, analytics startup called olo.net. This database, there's a competing open source database, meaning it's free, on sourceforge. The problem with that is that it's pulling data together from different sources, so there are data quality issues much more than we have with this database. It gives us the top 5,000 projects, open source projects. So on SourceForge, you may find roughly 180,000 open source projects these days. The estimates I've seen, and my own estimate would be that in total, however, maybe the number of working, active open source projects is like between 18 and 20,000 projects. Most of the projects on SourceForge are either dead or just placeholders. So the real number is much lower, but of course it's still a big number, of which we have 5,000. Olo took the top projects, and that is measured by the number of inlinks, as Yahoo search engine provides that information. So we can say we can analyze the top 5,000 projects, and so we are interested in questions to ask about open source that apply, obviously to make predictions, but that apply across a large range of projects. Here are some of the questions we ask. Obviously, just to make our internal case for open source is important. How is it growing? Then can we use agile development practices as proxies for open source development capabilities? What are the top programming languages, since we are all using UI libraries and what have you from open source? How would you staff as you get engaged with an open source project, speaking as a corporation? Maybe go into data quality issues in the questions and answers. Here is the initial curve I had, now with a slightly different take. Again, it's activity in open source project as measured by number of lines contributed each week. As I showed you, we get an exponential curve with an okay fit here. If we don't look at the activity, but if we look at the total number of lines of code, the total growth, we get exponential curves. The blue one is taking the lines of code literally, and the red one is an approach where we try to account for copy and paste that's going on, where we have a simple mechanism to take out what we believe would indicate copy and paste situations. So that's why the red one is lower. For our argument, it doesn't matter. We get an exponential fit in both cases, and actually a pretty good fit here with 0.96. So we can fairly confidently say that open source is growing exponentially. As you look at it in more detail, what you'll see is that it's not the individual projects that are growing exponentially in lines of code, but it's the number of viable open source projects that is growing exponentially. There have been studies of the individual projects. It's linear or geometric growth, but it's the total number of viable open source projects that's growing exponentially. Here a second question that we found interesting. I hope that's one of my aspects here. You find interesting as software engineering research too. We wanted to know, how can we hire for open source? How can we hire people that, that will do well in open source projects as we engage as a corporation more and more with open source? And so one theory was agile software development methods like extreme programming or Scrum or the Crystal methods. They are good proxy for the skills that you need in open source software development. And we ask that because you can take courses, classes on agile skills, but not really on open source software development. It's a non-trivial question to ask. It's a long way from some high-level hypothesis to what you can see in data. What we said is that agile software development, by definition, is represented through its practices. Two of the core practices are short iterations, like release every week. Scrum, for example, goes down to like weekly releases, obviously small releases, but clearly releases that your customer or user could take, as well as continuous integration, meaning checking in frequently small chunks of code, building right away, running regression tests right away. And so we said this exemplifies agile methods. And we can see the expected, and the question then becomes, can we see the behavior expected to follow from these practices in the data? And what we did is we looked at the size, commits, the size of code contributions to open source repositories, the commit size, commit is a code contribution obviously, and then the frequency with which people are contributing, because that's data we can get. Now you'll always be argue what's the correlation, causation, what have you, but we think it's a good indication. And what did we find? Here's the commit size. It's been fairly constant over time. Our database, because it reads in the whole revision history of each project, has all the fine granular actions of developers. Each individual check-in with the comment and possible cross-reference to a bug tracker, what have you, all the way back to like some of the really early projects. And what you see here is the commit size hasn't really changed much. Agile methods were articulated around here, and our assumption was, initial hypothesis was, the commit size, people who move from traditional corporate software development to agile development, they will check in much more frequently, much smaller sizes of chunks of code. And what we find is code size has remained pretty much the same. There's no serious downward trend. And same thing, if we look at the frequency of commits per week here, per developer, they are still checking in as regularly or irregularly as they did many years ago. So no big change there either. It's of course a question now again. That's the data. What can we seriously interpret from it? One could argue, for example, that, well, maybe open source always was agile. And that's a valid point to be made. One could argue, well, this is a summation across all these 5,000 projects. Maybe assembly language, which is in there, that never had, that's old and stodgy, and Ruby is really agile. So we accounted for some of these arguments like programming languages, and we did not find any significant difference to this here. So our assumption is that open source development here is very much its own and has not been strongly affected by agile methods. Yeah. So let me move on to my final aspect, open source best practices. So there's quantitative analysis, obviously, but then is what are the social practices around open source? What do we need to teach our people? What do we need to do to be effective as a company in open source software processes? And they are really quite different from what you're used to if you're a corporate software developer. We think what makes up open source software processes are these three properties. typically people say open source is meritocratic, meaning that the contributions are based solely on the value. The way it's used in the literature, in my opinion, is actually it's an umbrella term for 3 different things, one of which is a narrower notion of meritocracy. Again, like what you do really is evaluated based on its quality. It also means open source is accessible, and I'm making these points because it's in contrast to corporations. The projects are out there. They need to be out there because they rely on volunteer work. So they want to be accessible. They do not try to hide themselves in a silo on some random server under some cryptic names, as you frequently have it in corporations. And finally, and a big area for research, is the open source processes are self-organizing. Linux is being developed quite differently from Apache projects, which are being developed quite differently from Eclipse or PostgreSQL. So it's also, I really like this. I think these different aspects are something, we call it open collaboration to make the point. It's not just open source. You find that in wikis too. You find that in OpenSpace, which is a meeting method for organizing small and large meetings. It's really a tight change and collaboration, whether it's software, documents, or just organizing your conference agenda. So we look into that, and I would like to look at a specific practice at software forges, which are actually a platform for research. I have high promises, high expectations of this. So who knows SourceForge? Probably everyone. So SourceForge is the example of a software forge. It's a web-based integrated tools platform that gives you everything for your software development needs. And inside corporations, we now find software forges. We find them as a way through which customers engage with the ecosystem. So ThoughtWorks, a consulting company, or Sugar CRM is using a software forge to build the ecosystem around their services and open source projects they are doing. There are different uses. There's the internal use, there's the outreach and strategic external use. I will focus here on the internal use because we are interested in taking the best of open source practices inside the company, SAP, and I believe that applies to many companies who learn that some of these collaborative practices really make sense and can improve their own processes. So there are 2 arguments to be made. Well, I'll make them in a second. So this is how it looks like, our internal software forge. It's based on GForge. IBM has exactly the same thing called IIOSB, internal open source software bazaar or something. I just like SAP Forge better because it's shorter. It's a platform. It's one point you go to as opposed to many different project servers. It's just one URL. It gives developers a view. If you've been on SourceForge and are a developer there, you just know it, which has your to-do list and the projects you're on, etc. So you have a project portfolio or a developer view. And of course, you have a specific project view where you see all the different tools that you may need around your project right next to each other, easy to reach. And most notably, communication and collaboration, your forums and lists. And I'll come to the significance of making this open in a second. SAP Forge, our internal forge, has existed only for a year, but has been growing nicely. We're at more than 500 developers. It's still optional. And given that maybe we have around 10,000 developers, that's already a sizable voluntary chunk. So what's happening here is that forges basically gave you 2 benefits, growth benefits. One is a traditional benefit that actually the integrated case tools of the early 90s tried to give you, which is that you simply have an integrated tool set at one place that just works nicely with each other, where there's reporting going on and just good tools, etc., as opposed to 15 different locations like 10 web locations today on the intranet and 5 client tools for one project. So it just makes you more efficient as you browse around and do your development tasks. That is what case tools also did. But what software forges do is they have been designed with the mindset of the open source software community. And open source does not work with a top-down assignment of resources. It always is looking for volunteers. There are never enough people in open source projects. So a consequence is that these software forges are set up to make it easy to gather volunteers, something that you just don't find in corporations. So a software forge is set up such that projects are findable, searchable, so you can search inside the contents, you can read up on how design decisions were made, and you can contribute easily. It's as simple as, let me go here, searching for a project because you're interested in something, going to the forums, reading up in the forums on how design discussions have been done and how design decisions in the past have been made in writing as opposed to on a phone conference or in a meeting room, and then just hitting the reply button to contribute if you care about this. That's the open source way. And what it does is it gets people, it gets projects, even inside corporations, volunteers. So that's hard to emphasize how important that is, say, for us, as we can attest to this, we see it happen. In corporations, you have a tradition, your traditional process is top-down resource assignment. You do product planning, different people, development organizations get so and so many people for the different projects, and that's what they spend their day on. Just using a tool, the software forge, that has certain properties made it happen that people, software developers who cared about certain areas, certain types of projects, started voluntary contributions to other projects. So I have my prime example here is actually a research project by our colleagues in Montreal, which is about going shopping with your cell phone. It's only 3 full-time researchers on it, but they have by now more than 16 volunteers from all across the organization. These aren't researchers. These are developers, some product managers across the organization, and they don't spend their days work on this volunteer project. Obviously, they have their day job, but the point is, if you're from somewhere across the organization and you spend half an hour, you go home at 5:30 rather than 5, or maybe 7:30 rather than 7, because you care about a specific project, your expertise, if you just get broad enough contributions, your expertise can save the main developers a huge amount of work if you just know the right bit of information that the main developer would otherwise spend days working on. So we get this expertise, we get goodwill across the organization, we have the project got connections across the organizations, an additional customer that it wasn't aware of, possibility for research to product transfer that it wasn't aware of. Just this early exposure, in this case of a research project, got it this buy-in, expertise, voluntary work, and I think actually from a research perspective, an excellent way of instigating early engagement of product units with research units to make sure you don't end up in a situation where some research project is late and has tried to be thrown over the wall to some development unit, which typically doesn't work as a transfer. So we found that in fact, open source software forges prevent or aid overcoming the silos that you frequently find in software development organization. I think I'm done, so I'll stop here and hope for interesting question. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say.
In support costs as well, because that's one place where Microsoft really drives its products. It says, oh, we have lower support costs.
Yeah, so this is really an illustration of a core aspect, and I mean, economic reality has many other disturbing factors to that. I'm really trying to make a specific abstract point here, how replacing closed software with cheaper open source software where there's no vendor lock-in can give you the pricing flexibility to deal with that. Yeah, I mean, as SAP, which actually makes most of its money in the maintenance part of the revenue stream as well, we do understand that. So this really is an illustration. I think the fundamental argument doesn't change, though. So it still applies, and it just looks a bit different if you look at that revenue stream.
Have you looked at different types of licenses, and what effects those have on how projects are organized and how developers work?
So you mean in terms of analytics or of economic models?
Anything. I mean, anything that distinguishes between, say, GPL, MIT.
Yeah. No, we haven't done any detailed analysis. I mean, we looked at some stuff like what is the most popular license, and it actually is the GPL. It's like at around 70% still, which I found surprising. But that's not a good measure, as something like Eclipse was counted as one project, so that's a bit tricky. The license, there are the economic consequences of the licenses. One thing I wonder about, but this is just answering or taking a question maybe in a wrong direction, what it means for commercial open source software firms to use a dual license strategy. I didn't talk much about it, but this is a preferred economic strategy. You provide to the community the software using the GPL, so it's viral. What it basically does is it prevents that there's a strong competitor to you, because you and only you, the commercial open source software firm at the center of the market or the project, can actually change and move the project forward. A fork would always be GPL, so nobody could build up a competitive advantage by proprietary additions to the software. The consequence of that is, yes, it positions the company well and stabilizes its competitive advantage. However, I've always wondered, and I'm unclear about this, so this is future research, if you will, so about what it means to the actual growth. And so if we look at how SAP grew, we grew because a huge amount of the money spent on ERP system doesn't go to SAP, but to our implementation partners. In the first year, where an SAP solution is implemented, of $1 that goes to SAP in license fees, $6 to $7 go to the implementer, to IBM or Accenture, in the implementation project. And then SAP makes money in the maintenance curve. So we have these partners who have a revenue curve like this, a peak when they do the project, while SAP has a long curve. Now, that required this kind of sharing with our ecosystem partners. And I'm really curious how Sugar CRM and the other commercial open source software firms out there want to grow if they stifle, in my opinion, the growth of their ecosystem, because they, by the way of the dual license strategy, don't allow these other companies to have their small competitive differentiator in the market, because the GPL always prevents that, or mostly prevents that. So that's one aspect. Otherwise, anything particular about licenses you were asking?
I mean, there's a lot of discussion right now about with GPL v3 and whether there should be an LGPL v3, questions like that. I mean, the economics is certainly relevant.
So licenses are a tool, obviously, for certain business models. So it's important to look at them. Yeah.
So the question about the origination of open source projects, I believe they could either start from scratch, where someone just starts writing something, but an open source project could also start when a company converts a proprietary project to open source.
Yeah.
So I'm interested if you have any knowledge in how frequently that second type of origination occurs, and also what are the factors that promote that or prevent proprietary projects from going open source?
So I don't have any hard data, just general observation. It's obviously the preferred method these days to go open source with your software if you're a commercial if you're a startup. And I think a thought experiment can help see why that is the case. Just imagine that you are a traditional closed source company in some market. Maybe CRM was hot at one point of time. And so you would think that you could be winning in the market, but now you're the second competitor, like second place in the market, and you see your proprietary solution is losing against the other guys because they are just better. Now the question is, can you get a second chance of winning the market by open sourcing? And as we increasingly learn how to do open source projects right and how to engage with the ecosystem and community and all that, it seems obvious to me that the CEO of the second best company will want to go open source as a strategy to getting a second chance at winning the market. Now then, if you're the CEO of the leading company and you have to think about what your competitors are doing, and you know that a reasonably smart second place competitor will open source, the question obviously arises, why don't you go open source yourself first and stall that competitive strategy against you? So I think this is kind of what we are seeing, why if you don't have very strong intellectual property that can prevent competitors, that's why I see I think a lot of startups are going open source right away. But I want
what could motivate an organization with more or less monopolistic powers, like either the government or a platform provider, to open source their software?
I think that there's any number of reasons why they would want that. You can look at the Eclipse platform. Why did IBM do that? The way I hear it is that they were simply not making any substantial money in the tools market, and so they felt that maybe they can share some of the costs. That's certainly one reason why you go open source with a platform, for example. I mean, it can always be, governments can be driven by a desire for the common good or can demand it. Actually, in research, we see it a lot that if there's government involvement or sponsoring, that there are requirements that whatever the outcome of the research project, say European Union funded projects, that be provided in open source form. That still doesn't say much about the intellectual property in the source code. That's a whole another bag of issues, the patents or whatever that companies may still have. But I think there are any number of reasons. It really depends on the situation. All right?
Well, I have a question more, I think, about the SourceForge situation. SourceForge has always been very project-oriented, and one of the things which I would like to see is a separation which would allow components to be elements in the SourceForge so that you could somehow search for the best sorting engine or the best search engine which is incorporated in a variety of products. The granularity is wrong, I guess, or at least in some instances. And I know that I've taken SourceForge products and provided a surgical removal of a certain section which fit into another context. But then I lose a lot of the long-term benefits of an open source system because I don't get to easily track growth in that particular product or component.
Okay, but let me, I think you're right, and the initial, so the question is very good. It actually makes me realize that I didn't do my argument too well with Forge being a platform for research. I mean, now that you have that integrated tool set, that database that gives you information across all these different projects, it's a platform, and the whole industry is always playing a platform strategy. So what you can do with this combined information is, of course, for example, to write tools that do code analysis across all these projects and say, make you realize or aid you in a decision process, shouldn't this be a library here and be moved into its own project. Or a thing we are doing that's been very successful for us is like, if you're a developer with this and this these projects, like why wouldn't you want to look at these other projects that look related to what you're doing, or that you're connected through a social network graph, what have you, in order to foster this volunteerism, like through a recommendation engine in this case. So once you have that platform, once you have all that data in place, it's literally open for what analysis and then recommendation tools you can build to make your software engineering, even your architecture, better just by code analysis. By one thing that I suggested didn't really fly in particular with the still strong German labor laws in the company is, of course, like economics around developer behavior. What you want to incentivize, give incentives to developers who volunteer a lot. What you want to see that when you see a document, but do you think it's a good idea to build this, to make the network explicit, to show how someone has broad expertise and can help and all that. And so this platform is really important to do different things, like you mentioned, like pulling out a component. I don't worry about losing data because of that, because it's just a refactoring, and you always can or should be looking at the whole thing. So that's just a known type of change then, I guess, that you can work with.
Just to follow up, there's recently a very large number of the social systems have begun to produce APIs and make those publicly available, even though the actual source code that they support is not. But a SourceForge-like repository for APIs would seem to me to be also an important component of open source, or at least open interface systems. And I haven't seen anything like that. Is there some way we could encourage their development?
So you mean, is it like a service repository that you can go and look search? So I mean, the APIs is one thing, but why would someone be looking for an API? Because they want the service behind from the API, or? Usually
that's the case. But for example, I think in the last few days we had MySpace opening their API in an open fashion. Facebook has done the same, and I think several other social network systems as well. And those kinds of APIs are maintained by the company that developed them and available through their under their control. But a more central repository would seem to me to be a very helpful feature.
Yeah. It sounds like a good idea in that it makes life easier for people who are looking for these services or want to compare them. I doubt that the companies themselves would want to prevent that, because the reason why they lay their APIs open is, of course, they want everyone to build on their platform, right? Whether it's the Google APIs or the MySpace or Facebook applications API. So yeah, it would need a third party. Maybe it's a startup idea. I don't know.
Do you have any other questions? Comments?
Sure. Have you looked at or compared companies that that create their open source product versus other companies that maybe provide their product for free but not open source, like such as Google, for instance? Have you done any kind of comparisons? What might make it more of an incentive for a company to open source their free product?
No, I have to say we didn't really look at that much. I think the reason is to the extent that we look at companies that are like smaller companies or startups, it really is the open source aspect of it that we were wondering, how is it driving their marketing, reducing marketing and sales cost, and is this something that SAP could also be doing? And I didn't talk about it much, but of course we see possible business models for SAP using similar strategies that both benefit our customers and SAP.
Did you study the open source developers themselves, like the community ones, as far as how many hours a week they would contribute, or whether it's their full-time?
So this is not in, well, to some extent, because we needed a measure of how are these folks contributing full-time or part-time, etc., but not in a consistent model. So I can only provide, if that's the background of your question, anecdotal evidence about how we see more and more people, not just, I mean, it's obvious with the exponential increase in open source that more and more people are moving into open source, but most notably they are being paid by companies, obviously, to do so. For us, the Eclipse platform is particularly important, so we look at what people are doing there. It's very interesting. It's not at a stable situation in the sense we have some known truths there, but the most recent development that I found amazing is how companies hire developers with the explicit goal of becoming a committer in an, say, Eclipse open source software project that's important to the company. And it's literally a performance goal. So if you don't make a committer in 16 months or so, you're out and things like that. So the understanding of the position and of being a committer in open source projects is growing, and it's quite important. So yes, obviously more and more open source software developers, more and more full time.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
For information on other online Stanford seminars and courses, please visit study.stanford.edu.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.